Welcome to our Untamed Roots podcast. I'm Natasha, and today we are talking about the history of witches. This episode begins with a twisted tale with incredible research done by my best friend Kelly and read by me. Have you heard of the Tilly Bend Witch? She asked me. No, even though I'm actually from North Georgia as well, this is a story I haven't ever heard of before. Kelly then says there's a story going around Blue Ridge, Georgia, that a witch named Elizabeth Jane Bradley was hanged at a church after her daughter was murdered. According to local legend, Elizabeth was a folk healer of Mixed Creek native and European heritage. She was born in 1846, married at the age of 22 to Jason Riley Bradley, and together they had a large family. She died at the age of 60 in 1906. The story says two of her daughters married into feuding clans, one into the Tilly family and one into the Stanley family. Similar to the Hatfield and McCoys, the Tilly and Stanley families got into many arguments. Unfortunately, during one of these fights, one of Elizabeth's daughters was fatally shot. It goes on to say that after her daughter was murdered, Elizabeth, the mother, put a curse on anyone in the area to keep them from having a living child. Still today, if you go to the cemetery, there are many children and babies buried there. Elizabeth's grave is even facing a different direction from the others. This implies she can't enter heaven when the rapture happens. This is the story everyone hears, so it must be true, right? Well, not at all. Kelly goes on to say that after visiting the area a few times, she just couldn't quite believe any mother, witch or not, would wish death upon the unborn. She immediately started searching. She wanted to find the actual truth and have facts to back it up. The part of the story that is true is that Elizabeth Jane Bradley was a mother. She had many children. Unfortunately, the church was flooded due to a dam being built. They rebuilt the church on higher ground, but important documents were already ruined. Most people would give up, thinking that was the end. Not Kelly. She decided to research Elizabeth's daughters. According to the census, she had 5 daughters and 2 sons. All of her daughters lived at least into their early 50s and beyond. The interesting part is that none of them married into the Stanleys or the Tillys. In fact, Elizabeth was a Tilly before she got married, and her brother was a preacher at the very church she's buried at. No one was even shot or murdered, according to death certificates. Elizabeth very well could have been a healer or even a midwife, but she didn't curse babies. She didn't put evil on people. She was a woman who was doing her best to survive the harsh mountain area of North Georgia. Kelly concluded by stating that she isn't sure how this story got started or how she'll ever know who or why someone decided it would be fun to put that kind of label on an innocent woman. Not the label of being a witch, but being the person who cursed babies, especially someone who isn't even with us any longer to defend herself. Kelly truly hopes Elizabeth finds some kind of peace, knowing people know the truth now, and that someone had cared enough to dig into her story and pour their heart into setting the record straight. Thank you, Kelly, for telling me this story and allowing me to share with listeners what you felt passionate about correcting in history, and for giving us a prime example of a common theme throughout the history of witches. Now, before we tie this all together, we will come back to Elizabeth Jane Bradley's story in just a moment, but let's talk a little bit about the history of witches in a different way. Witches appear in every corner of the world, from European countrysides to African villages, Asian mountains, and American colonies, even the mountains of North Georgia, as we just heard. This is going to end up being a series because trying to fit all of the history into one episode is pretty much impossible. It's important that we get a sensible definition, though, of what magic is before we really dig in. So magic itself is morally neutral. The determination of magic being good or bad depended on who was using it and also who was judging it. The word magic often suggests something fictional or childish, and that is because of how Hollywood has portrayed it as something imaginary and not how it was historically or academically understood. At its core, magic is a belief system. It is a practice based on the idea that intention and symbolic action can influence outcomes. This perspective suggests that results stem from unseen connections between things rather than through physical force. The boundaries between religion, medicine, and magic simply didn't exist at the start of the witch hunts the way they do now. Even in ancient times, often usually women would perform incantations for protection, fertility, healing, and communication with the divine. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, there are 3 types of magic. Productive magic. This is magic people use to bring about good results, such as hoping for a big harvest, good weather, or a successful wild game hunt. Protective magic. This kind is meant to keep people safe, typically using charms, amulets, or spoken blessings to ward off danger, illness, or even bad luck. Destructive magic, also called sorcery. This type is intended to harm people and often is connected with envy or conflict within a community. These categories help scholars understand how different cultures use magical thinking either to support life, defend against harm, or intentionally curse others. These topics will be covered in future episodes, that way we can dig into each one more clearly. So, where did it all begin? Who were the first witches? The word witch was once a title of respect before it became viewed as something evil. The etymology of the word witch originates from Old English witche, which is female, and witcha, it referred to those that are male. It is people that are capable of shaping the unseen, such as healers, star readers, and people deeply attuned to the natural world. The word witch didn't start as an insult. Originally, witch wasn't a moral label. It didn't mean good or bad. This shift happened as Christianity became institutionalized. Anything existing outside of church authority became questionable. Folk knowledge, herbalists, and those who practiced divination didn't seek permission from the church, so the label stopped being respected and became feared. The church wanted control. They wanted people that they could manipulate, and they didn't care if that meant innocent people were harmed or given death sentences. By the late Middle Ages, the word witch was used to easily shun those who wouldn't bow or conform. Most often, women, the poor, the elderly, and the outspoken. Basically, anyone who wasn't easily manipulated into conforming, or anyone they didn't want to care for, such as the elderly or the mentally ill. The word witch didn't change who these people were. It was a shift in power and enormous ego-driven authority that changed how things were structured. Here's the bigger question. How did we go from seeking out magical healers and respected spiritual intermediaries to witches being hunted, tortured, and murdered under the assumption they were pure evil? This shift happened in medieval Europe, where fear, religion, and power collided. The devil. I'm literally constantly told that witches worship the devil all of the time. So let's dig into the devil for a moment. Christianity did not invent the idea of an evil adversary, but it significantly reshaped and intensified the figure that later became known as the devil. Earlier religious traditions already contained concepts of spiritual opposition. Christianity drew on those ideas and developed them into a single personalized enemy of God. Ideas resembling a devil figure appear in several pre-Christian sources. Jewish texts from the Second Temple period, such as the Book of Enoch, describe fallen angels who rebel against divine order. Hebrew Bible versus New Testament. In the Hebrew Bible, Satan is usually not a proper name. The word means adversary or accuser, and often describes a role rather than an evil being. For example, in Numbers 22:22 and the Book of Job, Satan functions as a heavenly prosecutor acting within God's authority. In the New Testament, this role changes. Satan becomes a more clearly defined, individualized figure, described as a tempter, deceiver, and the ruler of this world, opposing God's purposes and humanity's spiritual well-being. Early Christian thinkers helped formalize the idea of Satan as a fallen angel who rebelled due to pride. The horned, monstrous image of the devil does not come from early biblical texts. This imagery developed gradually during the Middle Ages, shaped by folklore, medieval art, and literary works. These representations reinforce the devil as a terrifying physical embodiment of evil rather than a purely spiritual adversary. Within Christian theology, the devil ultimately served as the framework for explaining moral evil, temptation, and suffering without attributing these directly to God. This interpretation helped reconcile belief in a benevolent creator with the reality of human pain and wrongdoing. The belief that witches worshiped the devil and entered into satanic pacts did not originate from ancient pagan practices or folk magic traditions. Instead, it was largely constructed by European religious and legal authorities during the 15th century. During this period, witchcraft was redefined from localized practices such as healing, divination, and charms into a form of nonconformity. Authorities framed witches as members of an organized secret conspiracy allied with Satan and actively opposing God and Christian society. By the 16th and 17th centuries, these false narratives fueled widespread panic, igniting the witch trials across Europe, then spreading to colonial America. This escalated into mass accusations, torture, and executions, despite the lack of evidence that such satanic cults actually existed. Keep in mind, a century is 100 years. We are currently in the 21st century, which means all of this began roughly 426 years ago in what we call the United States. There is no credible historical evidence that witches as a group ever worshiped the devil. The satanic witch stereotype was a theological and political invention used to justify persecution during times of religious instability and social fear. Returning to Elizabeth Jane Bradley, in hopes of giving her a better ending and giving my friend Kelly some realistic answers to her questions. If we look closely and carefully, what we find is people's desire for scandal and drama. They wanted someone to blame for things they couldn't explain or to cover up true evil actions committed by people in power. Or maybe to maintain fear in order to push unwanted agendas onto the town. It could have been all of the above. During Elizabeth's timeline, women usually weren't respected, records weren't actually kept or accurately kept, and as pharmaceutical and medical industries expanded, herbalists and midwives were often blamed for deaths or complications to distract people from systematic failures. What we do know is this: there isn't a reliable documented list of named brothers for Elizabeth Jane Tilley. Later, she became Bradley. What was proven is that she did have at least one brother, and he was a preacher. He served at or was closely connected to the very church where Elizabeth is buried. That detail alone matters. Even without absolute certainty, we can get very close to the truth by reconstructing what was realistic for that time period. In this history of witch accusations, especially in Europe, being connected to clergy, buried in consecrated ground, or associated with church life usually protected someone from suspicion, not condemnation. Yet in Elizabeth's case, that safety wasn't allowed for her. Common for that time, accusations didn't grow from evidence. They grew from unexplained gaps, missing records, misunderstood deaths, social fear, and the need for a human explanation. Elizabeth lived in the mid to late 1800s, but medically, her world resembled medieval Europe. There was no medical testing as we understand it today. No ultrasounds, no blood tests, no fetal monitoring, no understanding of genetics. Germ theory existed late in her lifetime, but it wasn't widely applied, especially in the mountains of Appalachia. Pregnancy was confirmed through missed periods, physical changes, and the feeling of movement known as quickening. When something went wrong, there was no way to know why by modern standards. This was a time when traditional knowledge and intuition were being pushed out, and anything that made those practices appear dangerous or evil was used to push corrupted agendas. The church and authorities worked in tandem to remove power from the people. Births didn't happen in hospitals, they happened at home. Doctors were expensive and further away in most cases. Although modern practices were frequently less effective than community healers, these midwives and experienced women who assisted in deliveries using observation, experience, herbs, positioning, and general knowledge, they were being pushed out and given the title of witch in an evil way. Before I continue, keep in mind that infant mortality rates before European contact were similar to or better than those of the 1800s, and in some areas, significantly better. In a future episode, I'll go much deeper into this. One reason Native communities had higher survival rates was because of the exact practices church and authorities later condemned and labeled as witchcraft. Knowledge passed down through midwives and healers. So that's interesting. And that's the key. Before spreading to the United States, the pattern began in Europe. Midwives were often the first to be accused of witchcraft. Why? Because they were usually at the intersection of life and death. Infant mortality in the 1800s, just like in medieval Europe, was devastatingly high. 10 to 30% of infants died before their first birthday, many within days or weeks. Causes included infection, malnutrition, birth trauma, and exposure, things people didn't really understand yet. Communities expected child death statistically, but emotionally, they still wanted to blame someone. And when science couldn't provide the answers, then suspicion fell on the women closest to the suffering. This is exactly what happened during the European witch trials. A stillbirth, a miscarriage, a sudden infant death, suddenly the midwife becomes labeled a witch. Not in the original sense, but as something evil and suspicious. The healer becomes dangerous, and the woman who knows too much becomes feared. Elizabeth lived during a transition period when folk medicine still dominated, scientific medicine was emerging. Records were incomplete, and religion moralized illness and death. After her death, church records were lost when the land was flooded. Facts disappeared, and then folklore just rushed in to fill in the silence. Child graves are common for that time, became convenient evidence to support a dramatic villain story. That's not unique to Elizabeth. That's just the common theme in recent witch history. Once someone was labeled a witch, facts suddenly became skewed and missing gaps in records was filled in with rumor. Ordinary women became symbols of evil long after they were gone and unable to defend themselves. So when we ask why Elizabeth Jane Bradley was called a witch, the answer isn't because she practiced dark magic. It's because she lived in a world without medical answers, because she stood close to birth and death, and also because records were lost, and because history has a habit of turning misunderstood women into monsters. She wasn't dangerous, she was just simply necessary. So what do you think really happened to Elizabeth Jane Bradley to become labeled as the Tilly Bend Witch? I personally believe she was a midwife or general healer. It's possible someone high up in the church or community tragically lost a child due to the realities of the time. Elizabeth, using her knowledge to help, may have become the target of retaliation and blame. If her brother was a preacher at the church where she's buried, or a nearby one, the accuser may have threatened him. If he defended his sister, he could have faced the same fate. Protecting his own household, if he had a wife or children, may have forced his silence. Once accused, facts no longer mattered. If that's the case, it wasn't uncommon for relatives to be turned against one another. This world has been extremely cruel in many ways. This is my personal interpretation of her story. I hope it fills some of the gaps and brings a little bit of closure for you, Kelly, even though it's heartbreaking and deserved a kinder ending. This is a huge part of what happened in the history of witches. This is only part 1 of the Witch History series. To keep up with future episodes, just send an email to ouruntamenedroots@gmail.com. Simply say hi and that you would like to subscribe to the newsletters. This will ensure you are added and not stuck in the spam folder. We also have other content on the website, ouruntamenedroots.com. Rest in peace, Elizabeth Jane Bradley, from Kelly and myself. Thank y'all for listening. I hope you stick around and become a friend.